On the very same day that Brown is handed down, the court very easily realizes that they have to deal with the District of Columbia. And the reason for that is um, they interpreted the separate but equal laws uh, to be a violation of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment applies only to the states and differences between the states. The District of Columbia, not a state. The District of Columbia is a federal entity. So on the very same day that Brown v. Board of Education is handed down, they issue a decision in Bolling v. Sharpe. In Bolling v. Sharpe, um, it's basically the same case. There's segregation in Washington, D.C. How do we resolve it? I will say the court spends significantly less time on this. It is also equally unanimous. Um, but the case that they have to argue, the case that the NAACP ultimately wins with, is they have to argue that there also exists a Fifth Amendment violation because the Fifth Amendment applies to the federal government and thus DC, whereas the 14th Amendment simply does not. But the Fifth Amendment does not have an equal protection clause. It's not there. There is no equal protection clause in the Fifth Amendment, which was absolutely the vehicle that was used in Brown, the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment. But the Fifth Amendment does have a due process clause. And so this case is resolved using the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment. So the issue in this case is, does the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment protect against segregated school systems within the District of Columbia? And the answer is yes, and the court has to work a little bit to get there. So while equal protection in the 14th Amendment may provide greater protections, the due process clause still provides enough protection, due process clause of the Fifth, still provides enough mechanism by which the court can actually do this. They argue in the case, particularly, that segregation is an arbitrary deprivation of liberty in violation of the due process clause. And that arbitrariness is kind of important here, is it's really doing the work. Because here they're saying that this arbitrariness is unfair and that being arbitrary is almost always a violation of the due process clause. So this is a huge stretch for the court. This is one of those decisions where in order to constitutionally make the decision that the judges want to based on policy, they want to strike down separate but equal in terms of education, even for the District of Columbia. They kind of have to stretch what the Constitution means. And they do so by reviving this idea of what is known as substantive due process. It kind of wakes up substantive due process. And we're going to cover substantive due process again in this court, or again in this course. But understand that this is an example of substantive due process. Substantive due process is a method by which liberties are read into the Constitution that aren't explicit within the Constitution, meaning they're not written down. This is an example of that, and it's using the Fifth Amendment to do so. So the reason why I cover this case along with Brown is because Brown is a very well-reasoned, very articulate, very persuasive case. And Bolling, to constitutional scholars, is not. It's not those things. It gets to the same policy end as Brown, but in terms of the constitutional mechanisms by which they get there, it really stretches the Constitution to actually do what it is the judges wanted to do. So this provides a nice juxtaposition where on one hand with Brown, we get a fully formed, articulate, persuasive argument. And in Bolling, we get a particular part of the Constitution be sort of wedged and shaped in order to fit the ends that they want. It's the equivalent of the Supreme Court taking a round peg and trying to put it through a square hole. They make it fit, but the process by which they do so isn't very pretty. But we don't, as scholars generally, to dwell upon this too much, because the policy ends ultimately make sense.